All right, good morning. If you want to read along this morning, we're going to be in Mark chapter 8 as we continue studying the Gospel of Mark this fall. We're going to begin today in Mark 8, verse 22. And we really have gotten to a turning point in the Gospel of Mark. It's a place where we're going to see the disciples and the crowds that are brought to something like a crossroads. But the interesting thing is that as readers, it brings us to a crossroads as well. It reminded me of a habit that I have, or a tendency that I have when I'm driving. Now, I pay attention to the road, but sometimes I'm thinking about something other than where I'm headed, what the destination is. And my wife's really kind about it, but it's got to drive her crazy, I know, that we're going someplace in particular, and I just go right past the road I'm supposed to turn on because I've got something else going on in my mind, or I'm talking about something, so I just drive by it, and she, through the years, gets more patient with me and will say, I think that was our road back there. And so I think we do that in life too. I think as disciples of Jesus, sometimes we're just going along with life and without even knowing, almost mindlessly, miss the path of discipleship. Miss the things that disciples are called to do. This text puts it before us today. We begin in verse 22 with the encounter, Jesus' encounter with a blind man. That's one of the stories in Mark that has no parallel in the other accounts. This is one unique to Mark. Jesus has briefly returned briefly returned to Galilee from an excursion that he took into Gentile territory. And when he got back into Galilee, the Pharisees argued with him, and so he got back in a boat, crossed the sea, and he's moving in the direction of Caesarea Philippi, where there's going to be an extensive amount of private teaching there. On the way to Caesarea Philippi, where that private teaching is going to happen, we get this encounter. Verse 22. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored. He saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." All right, now, I just want to say something about that verse right there, because it sounds a little, he sent him home, but don't even go into the village, and you might think, well, which one is it? I think that's a way of saying go home, but don't go talk to anybody. We see this repeated in the Gospel of Mark, this command to silence. And I think that's essentially what he's saying there, is it's a command to silence, as we have seen. A few things to observe here. We see first the familiar compassion of Jesus that we're seeing in story after story. Notice the details there. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. That gets me every time. You've got a private encounter. We're leaving the village. We're going away, just like in the story that we saw last week. And he took the blind man who couldn't see to navigate. He took him by the hand. And there's just something so personal about that. I don't want to miss something about Jesus in that. His connection with the man in his suffering, in the middle of his ordeal, just like we saw before. Also similar to the story we looked at last week is spit. And we've got this spit on his eyes. And he laid his hands on him. And just to underline something we said last week as well, this is not being weird or mystical. Jesus is communicating to a man who can't see. And you might say, well, he could hear, but touch is incredibly powerful, especially to somebody who can't see. My understanding is that for people who can't see, they depend upon their ears. Touch is incredibly powerful. It communicates something deep inside of them. And so Jesus communicates my life to your eyes and communicates it in a way that the man can see, a way that he can understand what Jesus is doing. The thing that's most puzzling, though, about this is that second touch, that he laid his hands on his eyes again. He asked the man, do you see anything? He says, well, I see people, but they look like trees walking. And it's kind of humorous to read, but it's also kind of puzzling. Well, what's going on there? Did Jesus mess up? The first time he touched him, did he mess up? Or did the man lack faith? What's going on with this touch? The second touch. Well, I'll tell you what I think is going on. I think that Jesus is illustrating what he is doing with his disciples, who at this point in the story are seeing blurry. So on one level, he is showing compassion to a blind man, and he's restoring his sight, and he does it completely. On another level, he's teaching his disciples, and what he does here with this second touch illustrates the journey that these disciples are on. If you look at it in the context, you back up to about verse 17, after we've had two feedings of thousands, the 5,000, then the 4,000, we see that the disciples realize, verse 14, they had forgotten to bring bread. They go on in verse 16, they're discussing with one another that they don't have this bread. And then in verse 17, Jesus says, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? He says, we had 5,000, and how many basketfuls did you pick up? You had 12 baskets of leftovers. Then there was 4,000, and we had enough bread for everybody, and you picked up 7 baskets of leftovers. Do you not yet understand? To this point in the journey with the disciples, they've been seeing Jesus, and yet they still don't see. They still don't get it. Their vision is blurry. When I think about how they must have heard that series of questions, they're thinking about bread, and Jesus says, do you still not get it? I kind of imagine their faces taken aback a little bit. And I'll tell you, that's me. It feels like every morning when I get up and read my Bible that I look at it and I say, here I am again, Lord. I still don't get it. How many times do you have to remind me? How often do I miss it? I really connect with these disciples who are so slow to get it. I'm also encouraged, though, because you see the faithfulness of Jesus to touch again. Say, yeah, you don't understand. You don't get it. Let me touch again. You're going to get it. You're going to understand. I love it. Now, between this point and chapter 10, verse 45, there's a lot of private instruction. Jesus is helping his disciples to see and understand better. And interestingly, it's framed by 2 stories about healing the blind. But this second part that we look at here is Peter's confession. This begins the section of private teaching. And this is a major event in Mark's telling of the gospel. This is the hinge point that I mentioned. If you can think back to our first week in Mark, talked about a hinge point that we would come to in the gospel. This is that hinge point. Peter's confession right here, and then in chapter 15, the confession of the Roman centurion. Those mark the unfolding realizations of what Mark told us in verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1. From the very start, Mark told us that, and then we see it unfold, and it's confessed. This is one of those places where that first hinge point comes. Mark 8:27, let's read it. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Who do you say that I am? That's the question put to every one of us. Who do you say that I am? Not that we get to define who he is. He does that. But we have to decide. We have to decide if we are going to believe and respond appropriately to what he says about himself. This confession, first thing I just want to mention about it, it is a remarkable sight. This is a huge moment. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. You are the anointed one. It has long been expected that God would raise up a new king, a king like King David, only greater. People have been waiting on this king to come, and Peter is saying, you're him. You're the one. You're Christ, and it's the right answer. That's what Mark told us in Mark 1, verse 1. Jesus is the Christ. He gets it. He sees it, but it's just partial sight. He just sees, kind of sees, like seeing people, but they look like trees walking. He sees that you're the Christ, but he didn't fully get it. You kind of pick up on it in verse 30 where it says Jesus strictly charged them to tell no one about him. We've seen that all throughout Mark. It indicates a lack of understanding. Jesus says that because there's a lack of understanding. So right here where he gets it right, Jesus says, don't tell anybody because you still have yet to fully grasp it. The first half of the Gospel of Mark is like the first touch of Christ to that blind man. It brings us to the realization that he is the Christ. The second half of Mark is like the second touch. It's going to show us what that really means. And it's different than anybody expected. So as we move into that second half, the second touch, where we see more clearly who the Christ is, we get the first of the passion predictions. Now, some of our kids, you may think of passion as a strong emotion or feeling. Originally, it meant suffering. So that's what we're talking about. It's a prediction of suffering. It's going to happen 3 times in this section of private instruction. This is the first time. Verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." That last line there gets me every time. It's so convicting to me. Setting your mind on the things. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Man, that gets me. It's plain teaching. He said this plainly. The Son of Man, this king with an eternal reign, would suffer, be rejected, be killed, and after 3 days rise. It's not puzzling, it's not unclear, it's not a parable, it's plain, it's straightforward. This is what's going to happen. He is saying, and this is where you've seen the clarity of sight, he's saying, I'm the long-awaited king, the Christ, and the predicted suffering servant from Isaiah. I'm the Christ, the great king, the greatest king that you've been waiting on, but I'm also the one who's going to suffer, the man who would be despised and rejected, the man of sorrows, the one who would not be esteemed but smitten and afflicted, the one who would be pierced and crushed for our iniquities and bear the sin of many. He is the king, he is the Lion of Judah, but he's also the lamb led to the slaughter. He is Christ the king. But he's a king who would suffer. And he's saying it plainly. But then you see this blurry side, okay? Peter, he's the one that got it right. He's the one that said, you are the Christ. But that's not the way he saw the Christ. That was not his vision of the Messiah. He envisioned a perfect king, wise and just and powerful, delivering his people from enemies, establishing an everlasting reign. And so Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, to rebuke Jesus. He's saying, this ain't going to happen. I think that's the way he put it. That's not who the Christ is. That's not what a king does. King doesn't suffer. King doesn't die. And before we start thinking, well, I would never rebuke Jesus, I have to come back to that question. Do I ever have my mind so set on the things of man that I dismiss the plain teaching of God? Do I ever do that? Who am I to say I wouldn't rebuke Jesus? I think it's pretty consistent that I've got my mind set on what I want and what my agenda is, and the plain teaching of Jesus is right in front of me, and I can so easily dismiss it or disregard it. Tables turn. You notice there he rebuked Peter, and he said, "Get behind me, Satan." Strong words. It's the same words that Jesus said when he was tempted by Satan in Matthew 4:10 in that account. Same words. I don't believe that he is saying that Peter is literally Satan, but in that moment, Peter was aligned with the enemy. He was opposing the will of God. There's an interesting detail. Right before he rebuked Peter, I had not noticed it until this study. Right before he rebuked Peter, it says that he turning and seeing his disciples. Why did he do that? Why did he I don't know. I think maybe it's indicating that Peter's not the only one who's crossways with Jesus. Maybe it's the other disciples too that have a blurry sight of the Christ, who don't think this should be the way that it goes. Disciples, they get crossways with the Lord. Then and now. We get our minds set on the things of man. This text brings us this question. When do I have my mind so set on the way I see it, the way I feel about it, the thing I want, the plans I've made? When do I get so focused on that I dismiss the plain teaching of Jesus? And I've just confessed to you that's a regular thing for me. So we come to the call at the crossroads. This text addresses us. Jesus addresses us at this intersection where our ways and God's ways get crossways. We come to this. Mark 8:34. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." First thing we see here is what's called the cost of discipleship. You notice in verse 34, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. That's the first mention of the cross in the Gospel of Mark. Right here, for the first time, we're introduced to that word, cross, this instrument of torture and death. Take up his cross. That's the call to discipleship. If anybody would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. I think sometimes maybe I don't know that we interpret this or apply it rightly all the time. Sometimes we think about carrying our cross as just enduring a difficulty that we're facing in life. And I don't want to diminish in any way the difficulties that we carry. We have some hard things to carry in life that we did not choose. They come to us and they're hard. And endurance is the way of disciples. But that's not what carrying a cross is. Taking up your cross it's a choice. And it's interesting in Luke that it says it's daily, something you do daily. It's a choice to do what is right and what is hard for Jesus' sake, no matter what it costs. That's what carrying your cross is. Saying, I'm going to do what's right and what's hard for Jesus' sake, because this is the way of discipleship, even though it's costly, even though I would rather do something else. I came across a great quote. I don't know who said it. It is unknown, but this makes it kind of memorable. This point memorable to me. The cross is I crossed out. man, that just kind of sticks with you, doesn't it? I crossed out. Whoever would follow me, let him deny himself. Take up his cross. It's choosing what's right and hard, the way of Jesus. No matter what I want, in spite of what I want, set aside what I want. It's about what he wants. Self-centeredness, self-indulgence, that's the way I tend to go. That's the way I can kind of mindlessly go through life, with myself in the center and whatever I want, whatever I will be indulged with. That is the crossroad that we stand in daily. What will I choose when faced with self-indulgence or the way of Jesus? Every day we're at that crossroads. So we see the cost of discipleship. We also see the cost of non-discipleship. Jesus says, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? He's saying two things of value next to each other and saying you've got the whole world on one hand, everything you could possibly want. How does that compare to your soul? There's no comparison. If you get everything you want, you lose your soul. It's this God-given personhood. This is your life given to you by God. It is a life that cancer can't take. Have you thought about that? Your soul. This is this God-given personhood to you that cancer can't take, or any disease, physical or mental. No tragedy or accident, no disaster, no weapon. As the song says, no power of hell, no scheme of man. None of the things that threaten our lives can take our soul, but it can be forfeited. And it often is, by men and women who don't seem to grasp the immense value of the soul. And they reject discipleship and with it the soul's redemption for cheap and short-lived pleasure. Jesus wants us to see the two next to each other. What are you choosing? This thing that is temporarily satisfying? Or the thing that would make for life for your soul? This is such a hard text. It puts before us a decision. It puts before us the ultimate decision. Costly discipleship to Jesus or forfeiting our souls. Puts before us a daily decision too. It's the way of the cross. Just thinking through it a little bit this week, just thinking about every day facing that decision. What am I going to choose today? Self-denial or the way of Jesus? Self-indulgence or the way of Jesus? Self-denial. We don't get to decide that we're going to be Christian and not also be disciples. We don't get to say, I want to be one of the saved, but not be one of the cross bearers. We don't get to wear the name of Christian and have the hope of Christians without the call to choose daily the costly path of discipleship. The way of self-denial, the way of the cross. We don't get to, you can't differentiate between those. We can't say, I want to be a Christian, but I don't want to be a cross-bearing disciple. They are the same. To be a Christian is to embrace the costly call to discipleship. And it's hard. But as challenging as this text is, as much as it puts before us the cross and says, choose this hard, difficult, self-denying way of Jesus, as hard as that is, you can't miss the main thing that comes across in it, the thing that he is teaching plainly to his disciples, and it is that Jesus chose the cross. That the one who didn't have to, out of the love of God, for our sake, said, I will embrace the cross. I will be the Lamb that takes upon himself the sins of the whole world, that makes it possible that you and I could have life. He did for us what we could not do for ourselves. And so as much as the text challenges us, and it says, you've got to decide, who will you follow? What are you going to value more? It also says, for your sake, for the immense value of your soul, he chose the cross. And that is good news, for which I am grateful today. That is the site of the second half of the Gospel of Mark. The second half has taken us there. It's taken us to the cross. It's saying this is what the Christ came to do. It is good news. He chose the cross to bear our sins, to redeem our souls, and we give thanks today. Maybe you need to make a decision today. Maybe it's that you are a Christian, you are a disciple, but you've not been walking in the way of the cross, and you need to take some time to repent and to ask your church family to pray with you to get back on that path. Maybe you've never made that decision for the first time in your life to decide, I want to choose to be a disciple. I want to become a Christian. I want to be baptized into Christ who gave himself for me, to have what you can only have in him. And it is the redemption of your soul. And there's nothing more precious than that. If you need to respond to that invitation, I invite you to do that now while we stand and sing.